Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight for getting ready for spring steelhead in the Great Lakes with Rick Kustich. We're in for a treat tonight. Rick was, well, personally, on a personal note, he was instrumental in my own process as a steelhead fisherman and getting into swinging a fly in the Great Lakes. When I was a teenager and steelheading in the Great Lakes, it was a nymphing game, and you heard all the time that steelhead wouldn't eat a swung fly in the Great Lakes. And Rick was one of the first people that I started to see changing that conversation a bit, and it inspired me to start fishing a swung fly in the Great Lakes, and I caught my first swung fly steelhead on a Rick Kustich pattern. And then, you know, one of the cool things to me about Rick is just how generous he's always been with his knowledge and his time. When we were getting Swing the Fly going originally, it was just a conversation. I didn't know Rick on a personal level, and I sent him an email out of the blue and said, we're starting this project called Swing the Fly. And instantly I asked him to be involved, and I got a reply right back right away. And he said, I'd love to. And from then on, Rick's written more articles for Swing the Fly than anybody else, and just has always been willing to share, and he's willing to share his expertise tonight. And I think we've all got a lot to learn, and so he's going to give a presentation and then be available for questions, in particular at the end. But I will be monitoring the comments as well throughout the evening, and if there's a comment that I think is particularly relevant to what he's saying in the moment, I'll try to jump in and relay that to Rick so he can answer it. Otherwise, if I think the question can wait till the end, we'll do that. So without any more, let's welcome Rick Kustich, and thanks for joining in. Take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Zach, and thank you for everybody for spending some time here tonight. The presentation I put together it covers just some general thoughts on steelhead, as well as some specifics, the way I think of steelhead fishing in the Great Lakes in the springtime. So the one thing I was just telling Zach before we got started here, when I'm starting to get used to all these virtual presentations, this has been 8th or 9th or something like that I've done this year. The one thing I do miss by through these virtual presentations versus face-to-face is sometimes I can kind of read body language, face language, what stuff is interesting and what stuff maybe is a little below the audience or above, to try to keep things rolling. So I think I have built in enough wide range information here for anyone that's kind of just getting started, to experienced anglers, and hopefully everybody finds some useful information here tonight. And as Zach said, anything that I haven't covered in enough detail, we'll have plenty of opportunity at the end for some questions. So again, I appreciate you spending some time here tonight. Just to kind of level set Great Lakes steelhead, their history is quite long, and steelhead were first brought to the Great Lakes in around 1875 from steelhead stocks from the McCloud River. So there's really a long history here. Steelhead have been in the Great Lakes longer than brown trout have been in the United States. So that's a fact that a lot of times surprises people. The distribution is in all 5 Great Lakes. Actually, by the end of the 1800s, there was naturalized populations in all 5 of the Great Lakes. And today, there's a number of populations throughout the Great Lakes region that are all naturally reproduced, wild steelhead. Some rivers have a combination of wild fish and hatchery fish, and some rivers are supported entirely through hatchery operations. So it's really a diverse fishery from that standpoint too. I'm going to steal a line from my good friend Jerry Darkus, Great Lakes steelheader from Ohio. And I'm not going to open up the debate on Great Lakes steelhead, but certainly there has always been a bit of some question as to whether a Great Lakes fish is a real steelhead, because it doesn't go out to the ocean and isn't anadromous. I've talked to biologists, a few different biologists on this, and they really feel as though it's the migratory nature of this fish that makes it a steelhead, not whether it goes out to the salt and comes back. So migratory nature, and you hear in the Great Lakes, is this, you know, very similar life cycle as a fish in their native environments, in that they start their life in a tributary or a river that runs into the Great Lakes, move out into one of the open waters of the Great Lakes for 1, 2, 3 years, and when they're sexually mature, they come back to, you know, technically that same river. So to me, you know, they're migratory fish. You know, they act very similarly to the West Coast steelhead. They genetically derive from West Coast steelhead. They look the same, you know, act the same, smell the same. So to me, they're a steelhead, and you know, really by any other definition. So that's, you know, there's always been some, and again, I don't even like getting into the debate, but I really do feel it's that migratory nature that really defines this fish. Just in the Great Lakes, for the most part, what we have are what are referred to as winter run fish. So they begin their ascent into the rivers, their migratory ascent, usually the preceding fall. So you'll start to see some fish moving in October, November, continue to trickle in through the winter time. But steelhead are spring spawners, so there's always that real push once you get to middle, late winter into the spring. And we're really getting into that time right now, really falling right into the middle of it. There's wide variations in the timing, you know, even within that spring time frame. And weather impacts so much of that, and we'll talk a lot about that later. But the weather conditions really can push spring fishing anywhere from, you know, maybe middle to early October, when we've had some of these real mild winters, really to even the end of March, you know, all depending on weather and conditions like that. Water temperature also plays an important aspect, and we'll talk more detail about that a little bit later. The geographic region really impacts run timing. So that, you know, more in the southern areas where the steelhead rivers are, like in Ohio and along the southern part of Lake Erie, those runs tend to start maybe a little bit later, and the season wraps up a little bit earlier, just because of it gets a little bit warmer there, in contrast to some of the northern rivers where you know, the spring fishing can last into May and even into early June. There are various strains of steelhead in the Great Lakes that can have some impact on the run timing. Particularly, I'll just use as an example the Manistee strain in Michigan. It's a little bit more of a winter and spring run steelhead, and that really, I think, is one of the reasons that you know, the fishing in Michigan is so good at this time of year. Really strengthens that run, and Ohio is also stocking some Manistee strain fish as well. So that's really strengthening the Ohio runs in the spring, you know, late winter and spring as well. The size range of the steelhead in the Great Lakes, I would say for the most part, is about 6 to 8 pounds is your average Great Lakes fish. The one thing that I like about this time of year is March has traditionally been one of my best months for the biggest steelhead of the year. December and March, for some reason, you know, you really get some of those larger fish making their, you know, initial ascent into the rivers. But for the most part, you know, fish in that 6 to 8 pound range of the average. Fish over 10 pounds are still quite common. Although I think in general, the lakes aren't producing the size of fish. And I just think it's just a matter of competition for bait than they did maybe 10, 15 years ago. I see that particularly Lake Ontario. I think some of the larger fish now are coming out of Lake Michigan, even though, you know, Lake Michigan has some, you know, some issues with respect to with numbers. You know, the greatest sizes still seem to be coming out of the Michigan area in Lake Michigan. It's important to check your regulations, and really doesn't refer too much to or relate too much to the United States rivers. But in Ontario, a number of the rivers are closed during the spring season. They coincide with the opening of the trout fishing to protect the spawning for trout, and really creates. It helps. You know, so I talked earlier about that there's some wild fisheries throughout the Great Lakes. You know, many of those wild fisheries exist in Ontario and also in Michigan. But Ontario's wild runs do benefit from the fact that there are regulations that close some of the rivers and some of the tributaries, or portions of them. So it's important to be mindful of that, and you know what the current regulations are in your area. I just wanted to go over, you know, just the general rivers that we find in the Great Lakes, and you know they're so wide and varied in terms of size and volume, and really impacts how you rig and how you fish those rivers. So there's certainly not one size fits all when it comes to the Great Lakes, you know, the Great Lakes system. Some of the rivers are quite intimate, you know, only maybe 100 CFS, where you can almost cast across them, you know, using some very light tackle. I'll talk a little bit about that. To some of the bigger, larger brawling rivers, like in Michigan, the Muskegon River, a misty morning on the Muskegon River, big and brawling, you know, has a you know, pretty forceful current. So the way I would rig on that previous river, that intimate, more smaller river versus the Muskegon, are going to be totally different. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then as we go through, you know, Ontario and other rivers in the Midwest, just some beautiful rivers that are almost have a Western feel to them. And again, you know, the size of these rivers will indicate and dictate how, and the flow will dictate how we rig for those. And then kind of ending here at the largest of all rivers, this is the Niagara, one of my home rivers. And it flows at about 200,000 CFS and drops off into God knows how deep. I don't. In some areas, it's impossible to measure how deep it is in the middle just because of the water hydraulics. But fishing along the edge with sink tips and heavier flies can be quite productive. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So the one thing that is nice about this presentation tonight, a lot of times when I do my general kind of Great Lakes steelhead presentation, I really don't have a lot of time to delve deeply into rigging, and I think that is, you know, really an important area. I think it's an area that causes you know, quite a bit of confusion, particularly if you're new to the sport. So we're going to try to put together a you know, different variations and scenarios here to, you know, cover how to rig for various rivers and various you know, in various situations. I'm going to start with talking about, and I think really one of the most confusing areas is, you know, talking about the lines and the heads that we use for spay fishing, you know, in general for steelhead. You know, I think this is, you know, probably has turned off a number of people to the sport just because of you know, how complex it can get. But I'll try to break it down, and certainly if people have any questions on this, we can delve into it deeper. But I just want to start out with talking about the difference between a head, a shooting head, and an integrated line. Shooting head systems have become so popular today in really in all swing the fly type of fishing. And really what a head is just has it has loops on both ends, and on one end it loops to a running line. On the other end, it's going to loop to a leader or a tip. And to me, there's a lot of advantages to these heads in that you only need to carry one reel, and you can make adjustments to the, you know, essentially to your fly line right on the fly. Carry 3 or 4 different lines with you that you can make adjustments either for a different rod or for, you know, for a different presentation. I like that approach and carry numerous heads when I'm out fishing. I think sometimes it takes, new anglers a little bit of time to get used to the idea of having that loop in their system. But I think once you fish with it for a little bit, it really becomes, second nature. Probably the one downside I would see to this is that the loop not going to the running line is a fairly large profile. So on days in the winter or maybe early spring when there's ice in the guides, sometimes it gets hung up a little bit on those icier guides. So one disadvantage that you have to be aware of. The integrated line is also going to have, generally today's modern spey lines, going to also have a head, which would be anywhere from maybe 20 feet to 50 feet. But it's going to be, and maybe 55 feet, but instead of having a loop onto the running line, it's just going to be a single integrated line right into the running line. And, the disadvantage of that is now you have to have one line per reel, essentially. One of the advantages, and not really from a steelhead standpoint, but when I'm trout spey fishing, especially with the streamer, I like the integrated lines because a lot of times I'm stripping that fly all the way back so that the head is going inside the tip of the rod, and then there's no hesitation, with that loop when I'm retrieving it all the way back. When you're spey casting for steelhead and swinging, generally the head is never going to come back inside the tip of the rod, only really when you're fighting a fish. So there's really some different, probably 4 or 5 different options. I've listed out 4 of them here for modern spey lines, and really the top 2 have become quite popular. What a Scandi head is, or a Scandi line, I mean, you can find manufacturers do make Scandi lines with an integrated running line, but for the most part, they're going to be made as a head that will be looped onto the running line. And what a Scandi head is usually about 36 to 40 feet in length. It has a very fine, long front taper. Creates it creates a lot of line speed, but also a very smooth feeling cast. And they're nice casting lines. What a Skagit line is or a Skagit head, and again, they can be in integrated lines, but they'll mainly be in heads, is a much heavier, has much more mass to it for its length. So generally a Skagit head will be anywhere from, a real short one at about 20 feet out to maybe about 25, 26 feet. And a lot of mass to these lines, so that they're really, their main use is to carry heavier sink tips, carrying heavier flies, weighted flies. Very versatile, a great fishing tool. Some of the earlier Skagit heads, and even today, they're a little bit clunky to cast because they just have so much mass. But some of the newer versions of the Skagit heads are they're being created with a little bit more of a front taper, and actually becoming a little more enjoyable to cast as well. So from a versatility standpoint, it's a line that I use quite a bit in the Great Lakes, particularly in this spring period. Hybrid line would be, or head would be, one that kind of incorporates the characteristics of both the Scandi and Skagit, and there's some available on the market. And I think those also have kind of allow you to enjoy the casting a little bit more, but still get some of the technical benefits out of the head as well. And then longer belly lines, I'd say, are anything that are over 40 feet, 45 to 55 feet. And where I'm usually generally going to use these lines are on larger water. Normally when I'm fishing a little bit higher in the water column, unweighted flies. These lines will either be fully floating, or my favorite versions of these have an exchangeable tip on the front, so you can make them floating, or you could put a type 3 or a type 6 type sink tip on them. But a very versatile line. So line selections, sometimes I'm making a line selection, based on the technical aspect of what it can do for me from a fishing standpoint. And then other times it's just more of a personal preference. And I enjoy catching fish. I enjoy, attempting to feel like I'm presenting the fly the best I can. But I also do like the casting aspect of spay fishing, and sometimes I get a little bit more enjoyment out of one line over another. Like trying to make a scandy head work as opposed to a skagit, just because there's a little bit more an enjoyable nature of casting that line. The next couple slides are just talking about tips, and so for the most part, from a steelhead standpoint in the Great Lakes, there's opportunities throughout the course of the year to catch steelhead at almost any level of the water column. And there's times where you can get them on the surface, just below the surface. But when the water is colder, like it isn't going to be in the springtime, at least for the next few weeks, unless we keep having record temperatures like we did today, for the most part, fishing the fly down in the water column will be the most productive approach. And I don't ever like dragging the fly along the bottom, but I like getting it in the bottom third. What I would estimate is the bottom third of the water column. And when the water's really, really cold and fish don't seem to be reacting real well, I might try to get it a little closer to the bottom. So in that, with that objective, there are a few different ways to get your fly down to the bottom. One of the I think versatile pieces of equipment to use in the Great Lakes are these poly or Versi leaders. And what these leaders are generally tungsten impregnated leaders that you have a nice taper to them. They're generally density compensated. So just because the bud is thicker and the tip is finer, they still sink at the same rate. I find these to be really good leaders to use. A real good way to sink your fly when you're using a scandy head. The scandy generally can turn over the leaders down to maybe a 5 or a 6 inch per second. And if you use these leaders with a lightly weighted fly or unweighted fly, that rig works pretty well. So I think more on the smaller size rivers, the more intimate rivers, the poly leaders work quite well. The next type of material that are the type of leaders that I use then on when I go to skagit heads and need to get the fly down deeper, needed to get it down quicker because of the volume of the water, the speed of the water, are these T material type tips. And you can buy the material in various lengths and make your own. And generally I just make my own by just lashing over the end of the material, or folding it over, looping it over, and lashing it down with a heavy tying thread, and then just finish it off with some glue, like Zap-A-Gap, something along that line. And then from there you can really make a whole repertoire of tips. And you can find this material in from T7 down to T17. I think you can even find T20. So it's going to cover a sink rates of anywhere from about 5 inches a second, probably down to about 10 inches per second. So what I like to do is carry, I generally like this material, and this personal preference on this, but generally like this material in 10 or 12 foot lengths. Sometimes, as pictured here, I'll carry some that are 14 foot in length for some really deep work. But what I like to do is carry a piece of T7 in 10 foot, piece of T10 in 10 foot, a piece of T11, piece of T14, so that as I need to make adjustments, if I feel like I need to get the fly down a little bit deeper, I can just, I'm keeping one of the variables steady in that it's the same length, but changing the sink rate. And another approach would be to keep your sink rates the same and change your length, but that tends to kind of change the anchor point of your casting and whatnot. So I like to keep that length the same as I make adjustments. And all this is loop to loop, looping on those tips onto the front end of the head. I got a loop at the front end of the tip, and I'm going to loop my tippet to that. So it's all loop connections. It really makes it quite simple. There's also density compensated tips, and these generally are longer, 15 foot. And the one thing I want to say too is just going back to that, you can also use those Versi or the poly leaders with Skagit lines as well. They cast and operate with Skagit lines as well. So you can kind of use them on either on airflow on the on the Scandies or the Skagit heads. The density compensated tips are generally going to be longer, 15 foot in length. A lot of times these come with the exchangeable tip lines on the longer heads, but they're also a versatile tip to use with a Skagit head as well. They do have a front taper, so they kind of help the whole Skagit head turn over better. And like I said, density compensated means that there is a tapering, but the tip will sink as fast as the butt because of how the tip is constructed. And that's versus a multi-density type tip. So the multi-density are a product like Rio's Mo tips, where the tip itself has various sink rates built right into it. So a 10-foot Mo tip might have start with a few feet of intermediate line, a few feet of type 4 sink, and a few feet of type 6 sink. To me, the idea behind those is a little better depth control, a little better fly control, but it also adds a lot more variables, to it. And I do use those a little more out west. I do find that kind of keeping my variables a little bit more limited allows me to control my depth a little bit better. With floating lines, so I've talked about longer headlines, Scandi lines. They'll match real well with just a long leader, to fish on or near the surface. So that those heads work real well, and usually those leaders will be about the same length as my as the rod, and that's again a good approach for when the water's warmer, fishing that fly up. It's also a real good approach to use the longer leader in situations where the water gets real clear. So I've had some good success, and this can be later in the spring. It's also a good technique for in the fall when when the water's low and clear, maybe early in the fall season. But the fish can maybe get a little spooky, a little turned off by using sink tips and shorter leaders from your sink tip, or even sinking leaders. And I've just found using a longer leader like that can really get a fish to take that might be turned off by a sink tip and a shorter leader. So I've used that technique like a long leader with a weighted fly. Good approach, good stealth. The other area where I've really found this to be helpful is using the longer leader with a little heavier fly. And this can be a really good cold water approach. And the reason I think that it works real well in cold water is that the lower diameter of the monofilament leader doesn't swing as fast. The current isn't pushing against that. It doesn't have as much surface area to push against like it has like a sink tip does. So in effect, that it just not pushed. There's just not that surface area to get pushed, and it kind of slices through the current a little bit more. It really slows the swing speed down of the fly, and I found it to be very effective, especially kind of swinging into the real slow water inside currents. Kind of just stays and hangs there instead of swinging through real fast. So a good thing to keep in mind, good thing to have in your repertoire for real cold water situations. And then just some kind of thoughts on tippet. So my tippet's generally going to be looped on to the front end of that tip. A lot of times I will use about 3 to 4 feet. Sometimes I go with about a 1 foot kind of a butt section and then the tippet. And really the only reason I do that is sometimes you get some wear and tear on that loop. So that this way I have a little stronger material that's looped together to combat that wear and tear. and then just have a 2 to 3 foot piece is my tippet. Always go heavy enough. I guess that would be the one takeaway from here. There's really never a reason that you should break off a fish when you're swinging a fly like this. First of all, I hate leaving flies and fish, and then secondly, I hate the thought process of thinking that potentially lost a trophy fish just because I wasn't going heavy enough with the tippet, or that I tied a poor knot. So always make sure that generally in the Great Lakes, I'm using somewhere between 12 and even sometimes up to 15-pound test. Sometimes I'll go down to 10-pound in real low clear water conditions. I think there's some definite advantage to using fluorocarbon, especially in clear water situations. It reflects less light, and certainly is a stealthier option, stealthier approach. It also has a little bit more abrasion resistance. So if you're fishing in areas where there's a lot of rocks and boulders and things like that, might hold up a little bit better if a fish gets you in those situations. The one, I think, downside of fluorocarbon is it is a little more stiff. The monofilament can be a little bit more difficult to tie quality knots with. So you just have to be careful that you seat the knot properly. You have to be careful that you lubricate the knots. You can heat it up real quick if you're tying a knot too quickly. So that's really the downside. It's one of the reasons that a lot of times I just end up using monofilament in the wintertime, is because I just feel like I can tie better knots, quicker knots, don't have to be quite as careful, particularly in the winter when my hands are cold and maybe not operating quite as well. But it is important to make sure that you do take a lot of care with your knots, and particularly in those situations, make sure that when you're using this heavier tippet like that, it's easy to not get the knot as tight as it needs to be, and it can back out or just weaken it altogether. So I think it's really important is to kind of take that time to make sure you get a really solid knot. If you tie a knot and it doesn't look good, retie it. It only takes a few minutes to retie, and it takes 2 or 3 or 4 months to forget about that big fish that broke you off because you didn't tie your knot properly. Zach, do we have any questions? This would be a good time to take a quick break.
Yeah, can you hear me, Rick?
I sure can.
I made a mistake a little while ago, and I wasn't coming through to you.
Okay.
Paul wants to know, how do you mark your 10-foot tips when you have a whole bunch of consistent 10-foot tips? How are you keeping track of which is which? Yeah,
so it's a good question. Some of the tips will come with a color coordination or color coding on there. So even you can buy like T7, T10, T11 in 10-foot pre-loop, pre-packaged. So those will have they'll have the color coding. So you just have to keep a note of what those color codings are. I just, for when I'm making the homemade tips, I'm just putting those labels on them, just using the pipe cleaner and a label with a loop on there, and just being really careful that I put them in the right place. I carry a number of leader wallets with me, or tip wallets with me, and I kind of had developed a system within those that I know which tip goes in which. So I just am careful during the course of the day to make sure I put them back in the right place and put the right label back on them. So that's my system. There's probably better systems, but it seems to work for me.
Thank you. I've got a question too. What do you have a monofilament preference and a carbon preference, a brand, and what pound strength?
So the monofilament, I just I'm using Maxima, and I use the Maximum Ultra Green. It looks like it should be better in the water, but I also use the the chameleon, the brown. And I think that actually reflects less light. And it doesn't look like it would, and it looks like it would show up better in the water. But I think, you know, from that standpoint, it is a bit of a, it does seem to reflect less light. But I just like the Maxima from the standpoint of the abrasion resistance. It just really seems to hold up well. And, you know, I don't seem to have to be as careful with my knots. As far as you know, I've used both for fluorocarbon. I've used both the Airflow and Rio, and I think both will make a good fluorocarbon. And in terms, I think he asked pound test. Generally 12, 13 pound test for the most part, and a little bit lighter in real low clear water conditions. Maybe a little bit heavier when I'm fishing down in the Niagara River and I'm in situations where I know I can't follow a fish very far. And you know, some situations where I really going to have to put the screws to the fish, then I'll go heavier.
Awesome. Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more about the Niagara. I think,
well,
go ahead.
Oh, anything else, Zach? Another?
No, I think you can carry on.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay. So just kind of cover the various rods that I use during the course of the year, and really need a full repertoire if you're fishing various rivers, you know, here in the Great Lakes. But, you know, my full two-handers are generally going to be 12.5 to 13 foot in length. You know, 7 or 8 weights. So they're generally going to be carrying a Skagit line of somewhere in the 525 grain range, and going to be carrying a Scandi head is somewhere in the 480 range. I really started using more and more shorter rods, and actually in the online version of the magazine for January, I put together an article on using shorter rods, and there's just a number of advantages I'll talk about here in a second. But I really enjoy, you know, kind of that more intimate connection of the shorter rods. And then on some of the smaller rivers, using you know, one-hand spey rods, either rods that are designed for one-hand spey casting, or just one-handed rods that been able to adapt to spey casting. So where I kind of line up and use various my various rods, certainly on bigger water is where I'm going to use the longer 12.5, 13 to 13.5 foot rods, maybe even up to 14 feet. Where I want to make longer casts, maybe where I'm going to be using longer belly lines, particularly when the water's a little warmer. I think one of the more deciding factors that I kind of incorporate when I'm trying to make a rod selection is how deep I'm going to be wading. And you can see even in this photo, I'm kind of, you know, well over my thighs. The longer rods certainly help in that situation. That's, you know, when I know I'm going to be wading deep is usually when I'm going to, you know, go for a larger or longer rod, longer stick, just to be able to utilize that leverage during casting. I line up the shorter, smaller rods on smaller water. You know, I think it creates a little more of an intimate connection to both the water, but also the fish. When I certainly enjoy fighting a, you know, 5, 6, 8 pound steelhead on a lighter, shorter rod, certainly enhances the experience. But I think really the advantage of it, particularly on some of these smaller waters, is I just feel I can get a little bit more line control, a little bit more of an acute presentation, especially when I'm covering specific structural elements. Allows me to kind of vary the cast, vary the setup, and kind of maybe hit a particular piece of structure from a couple different angles. So I just, as long as I feel like I can make long enough casts, I'm not wading too deep, I'm just fishing shorter and shorter. And what I mean by shorter rods are generally 11 to 11.5 feet, in that range. And then there's also really is a lot of application for one-hand spey rods. And, you know, either one-hand spey or one hand with a little two-hand assist. Like I mentioned, there's a few rod manufacturers that are making specific one-hand spey rods, but you can also just kind of convert a single hand rod, maybe an old, 10-foot 6 weight, old 10-foot 7 weight, and you find the right line to line up on that, and you can convert that into a one-hand spey rod. What I've really enjoyed about it is it's changed my tune on some of the smaller rivers near my house. I mean, there's been a few rivers where I kind of wrote them off, poo-pooed them since I've been spey fishing, and kind of just said, hey, they're too small. But when I line those rivers up with a one-hand spey, it's like, this is just about right. You're not making real long casts, but you can still, swing that fly and still, kind of line it up with the various structural elements that you find in that river. So it's really changed my approach and attitudes towards some of the smaller rivers that kind of had once written off. And with just going back to that real quick with the one-hand spey, you can use the same type of lines. You can use a Skagit on there. You can use a Scandi. You just need to load it up so that the grain weight is the right for that rod. And given the fact that if you are just using a single hand rod, you may have to do a little trial and error to figure out what line weight is required to line it up. One thing that I should have talked a little bit more about too is, for the most part with modern spey casting, particularly with Scandi lines, Skagit lines, we've kind of gone away more from the actual line weight designation on the rod to more of a what's the grain weight of that head. And, for the most part, I think that does create some confusion, particularly when you look at one-hand spey rods. One-handed rod might be a 6 weight, and a two-handed rod that's 12.5, 13 foot might be a 7 weight. But they take entirely different, the 7 weight in a full two-hander might carry an extra couple hundred grain weights more than a single hand spey rod would be carrying. So it gets a little confusing, but for the most part, most of the rod manufacturers provide most on their websites or in their catalogs, provide some guidance as to, what head and what grain weights for the various different types of tapers will fit best on their rods. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. And within that guidance, there will be sometimes some personal preference. Some anglers like to have a little bit more weight than what's recommended, and other casters a little less. I just want to talk a little bit, just a couple hints, tips on casting. I think Skagit heads. So given the fact they're just so versatile, I'd prefer to, again, I said that earlier, I prefer to cast a Scandi head or a longer headline. But the Skagit heads are just so versatile and such good fishing tools that they line up very well with fishing in the Great Lakes, particularly on some of the smaller rivers. The idea behind Skagit casting is that it allows you to cast heavier tips, maybe some heavy flies. So there are a few things that when I think about kind of this style, and I never really think about my casting in a certain style, but I certainly think about my casting adjusting to what I'm trying to do and really how I'm rigged. And with the Skagit head being shorter, I think most anglers or most casters would benefit by just really trying to slow down when they're making their movements. Very deliberate strokes. You want to keep that rod movement fairly low. Most of the time with a Skagit head, you'll find that either using the double spey or a snap T generally work. Those waterborne anchor casts generally work best with Skagit casting. So in both of those casts, they involve bringing that rod on the kind of the second phase of the setup, bringing that rod in front of you, kind of ripping that line across the water as you go into your D loop. I like to try to make sure I keep that rod fairly low when I'm doing that. The shortness of the Skagit heads make it very easy to kind of lose your anchor point when you're drawing back up into the D loop. But you also, when you're getting into that D loop, you want to be able to accelerate. and to form some energy. So just there's a delicate balance there between, kind of that slower movement, lower rod angle, and then accelerating kind of into that D loop and into your into the final setup there. As you kind of get into that D loop position, you want to just make a check to make sure that the line is all lined up towards your target. It should be in a straight line pointing at your target. I think it's a lot easier to attain that with the shorter Skagit heads. So it makes Skagit casting, generally a bit easier to learn, a bit easier to cast. But the other thing you really want to make sure is that, and it's really the kind of the benefit of this style is to maintain what's referred to as like a sustained anchor, meaning that your anchor point's going to be moving, particularly as you're setting up your D loop. And even throughout the the forward stroke, as you're going forward, your line's still going to be coming back a little bit before it starts going forward. And the I guess importance of that kind of movement, that sustained anchor, is that's what brings a tip or a weighted fly kind of to the surface as you're setting up the cast. Because without that, a weighted fly or a heavy tip is going to create too much, kind of tension or drag when you go forward. So I always kind of look to make sure that I got that line lined up, and I like to have my anchor coming kind of back at me as I'm setting up, and making sure that tip and fly is rising up, and it's not going to create too much drag on too much tension on the forward cast. Also keep an eye on your weighting depth. I can remember when I was starting out casting, I'd step in at the front, at the top of a run, and my casting would be going great, and I'd be just moving all along, and then maybe get down to the middle part of the pool where things are slowing down a little bit, and all of a sudden my casting would really just start to struggle. And I think initially I'd wonder why that was, and a lot of times it was just because of the depth was changing. When the depth changes, your cast changes, and I just learned eventually to make some adjustments to that. One of the things that that I do when I'm wading very deep, again with a double spay or a snap tee, is changing my rod angle a little bit when I'm ripping that line across. So that's kind of that second phase of the setup. Just kind of raise that rod tip up a little bit to help release some of that line as you're coming into your D loop. The other thing I like to do is just to try to gain back some of the leverage I'm losing by that depth, and just raise my hands up a little bit more. So instead of my upper hand maybe coming even with my cheek when I get into the D loop, actually raise it so maybe it's even with the top of my head, and just gaining some more of that leverage of that line, of that rod back. Just a couple little tips that seem to help when it's one thing when you're casting and practicing under good conditions, but when you get out into out into the water, there's always varying conditions, and sometimes we got to make some adjustments. I'm going to talk a little bit about the flies that I like to use in the spring, and really at other times in the year too. I like a fly that has good silhouette. It kind of looks like something that you would find in the water, a fish or other aquatic life. So I like to have that kind of silhouette, and this fly really helps to kind of portray that. I like a lot of movement. Marabou, rabbit, Arctic fox, things of that nature. Most of my flies will have one or more of those materials in there. I like a certain element of flash as well. As far as color goes and size, I would say when the water's dirty, off color, I like darker flies. I like bigger flies in that situation. And then as the water starts to clear, I'm going to go to more natural colors, more bait fish colors, and the flies will generally get smaller. But this is really just a simple pattern, just this Marabou spay. Yeah, I think Zach posted something last week about what fly would you use if you had to use one fly for steelhead. If I had one, if my life depended on it, this would be the one fly I would use. This black over purple with a little bit of flash in there. Just been a great producer for me, and here in the Great Lakes and also out west. This is kind of similar to that, but it just adds a little more length to the fly. Really good spring pattern when the water's up. Adds a little more flash. Just a few other elements to it in terms of the materials. I really enjoy, or I like using tube flies. I know either tubes or shanks. I think shank flies are a little bit more popular. I just like the simplicity of tubes. Just very easy to tie on, easy to rig, and really just like to be able to, position that hook where I think it should be positioned in terms of the material, and trying to maximize the hookups. When a fish takes a fly. I also like a lot of more bait fish patterns, and especially when I get into the springtime, it just seems like when the bait are on the move, there's more opportunity for, especially as the water gets a little bit clearer, a little bit lower. This particular white bunny spay has just been a killer for me over the years. It's funny because white just seems to be a good color in the Great Lakes. I've tried it a number of times on trips to British Columbia, and white just doesn't seem to work very well on the West Coast, but it is a real killer here in the Great Lakes. And then just some other bait fish variations can work really well as well. I like this one. You can either tie this smaller with Arctic fox or larger with like fin raccoon, but this has been a really killer for me as well. Take a look at some flies from some other tires. This is Justin Provanik. This is a Scandi Sculpin. Now, some of these flies were in a recent article in Swing the Fly. If you wanted to see I think I had all the recipes in there as well. And the interesting thing about this one, again, kind of that bait fish idea. It just seems like bait fish, particularly in the spring, work even better. In the Great Lakes than even in the fall. This one was inspired. I know a lot of Justin, he told me this was a lot of his patterns were inspired by Kevin Feenstra. I fished with Kevin like back in the 90s, and he was one of the first anglers that I saw that was really trying to imitate bait fish in the Great Lakes. And, he's still, that's still his approach. And he just put out a book on that recently. And he was tying these big sculpin patterns, and he had them on these big 6 and 7X long hooks. And this kind of is, an inspiration from that. But this has been a very good pattern for Justin. And talking about Kevin, Kevin likes the natural bait fish, and he also likes a lot of flash. And this one he calls the kitchen sink leech, and it has pretty much every color of flashaboo in there you can imagine. But it's been a very effective pattern for him. A lot of flash in the water, a lot of movement. Marabou also, in addition to the movement or the flash that marabou provides, it also does provide a lot of movement in the water. Very seductive. And this is a Greg Senyo pattern, the artificial intelligence. I think the key aspects of this is that it has a nice silhouette in the front, has a lot of flash, a lot of movement, very productive fly. And this is one from Nick Bionessa. Nick is a great tire, someone that I fish with quite a bit. And, again, kind of the bait fish idea. This is his Mr. Softy. Really good pattern. And then sometimes it's just good to go to small and subtle, particularly in the lower clear water. So as we get more advanced into the spring and the water continues to drop, there'll be opportunities. And the one on the left is one of my dirty little secrets, just a brown woolly bugger. I think if I said the purple and black would be my steelhead fly of choice. If I had one fly to just fish for any and all fish in the world, it would just be a brown woolly bugger. And it certainly is a really good steelhead fly. It's a good one to come back with if you get a yank or a grab on a larger pattern. And the other fly pattern there is a September spay, and that one's also a really good pattern for me. But those are just really good in low clear water or coming back to them. A fish that has grabbed the fly. So I talked a little bit about earlier, or mentioned it anyways, about how the weather impacts the Great Lakes fishery. And I'm going to make the comment here that when you live in the Great Lakes, you don't want to let the calendar dictate what's spring and what's winter. I think last week started out as winter, and today almost felt like summer. So today we almost skipped by the springtime. But I think the idea is, when the conditions arise and it feels like spring, doesn't matter what the calendar says. It's time to get out there.
Hey, Rick.
The two things that, yeah. Hey, yep.
Can bump in with a question?
You sure can.
Paul wants to know, do you weight your tube fly patterns, especially like compared to if you're tying the same fly on a shank? What do you do with a tube where the tube doesn't have built-in weight?
It's a great question, Paul. And actually, I was going to slide another slide in there. The one thing that I like about tubes is their versatility. So a lot of the flies I tie them so I leave a little bit of tube off the front, a little bit extra, and I carry cones with me. So the cones are the exact same, or that fit right over that tube. And if I keep the head small enough on the tube, and I tie it really tight, I can slide that cone right over that and turn it into a weighted fly. So I prefer to cast unweighted flies, but for the most part, there's a lot of times where using a weighted fly is kind of the key to controlling your depth or getting down into a specific spot or covering some specific structure. So yeah, it's a good question, and that's kind of how I approach that. Also, some of the flies I tie will have dumbbell eyes on it as well. All right,
Rick, before you get going again, wondering if steelhead will migrate upriver under ice, or do they wait for open channel?
I think they do. I think they move under ice. I think they generally, move though when there is some increased water flow or good flow. I think when you have those icy situations, I think it's also in conjunction with colder water. So in the wintertime, I think they generally pad up and don't move quite as much, but they definitely move under ice, but not nearly as much as they will once the ice starts to clear out and the water temperature starts warming up. But for sure.
Awesome.
All right.
You're good.
All right. So when I think of spring fishing, two things kind of come to mind: is how quickly the conditions can change. Between rain, runoff, water generally drops a little bit faster in the spring as soon as there's some vegetation starts to grow. So, I think in terms of that, you just have to take advantage of the conditions when they exist, and kind of get out there and do it. The other thing that I notice is that fish are, really moving more in the spring, which makes perfect sense. I mean, it's migration time. They've gone from kind of being, a little more relaxed in the fall and winter when they move in to being on a mission in the spring. So the thing with that is what I've really noticed different in the springtime fishing is, a lot of times in the fall, if you find a pool that's doing well, or if you hooked a few fish in a pool one day and you go back to the next, you usually can find a few fish in that pool again. It's just very common that, you can have some success in a certain pool or a certain area in the spring. You can go back there the very next day and all those fish will have moved out of there, or seemingly have all moved out of there. So it's really day to day, the changes. And I just real quick, story of Nick Pianessa. He went out Monday this past week, really hit the first rise in water temperature. Had a really good day on Monday. Went back to those exact pools that he did well on Monday and didn't hook a fish. So really just a perfect example of how quickly things change in the springtime. I mentioned earlier that water temperature is really a key thing, and to spring fishing. I always try to hit that first rise in the water temperature, and that right after ice out, right as things start to happen. It's really the best opportunity you're going to have to catch some of these really fresh fish that are on par with fish that you would catch fresh in the fall. So I really try to target that time. I think as the water temperature increases into the mid to high 30s, in the low 40s, that's when you'll see some significant increase in activity in this springtime period. That's really, again, good time period to hit some of these really fresh fish. Water flow is also very important. Again, try to hit that initial runoff. Some rivers, are more impacted by runoff than others. Certainly the rivers here in along the southern shore of Lake Erie, a lot more spate in nature than some of the rivers in Ontario or up in particularly in Michigan. But kind of hitting that initial runoff as that water temperature rises, that can be some of the best fishing of the year. Additional spring rains will rise the water, drop the water. Those changes in level will bring more fish in, kind of stir the pot for the fish that are there. So I'm always trying to get on the water when, right after a rain, right when the water starts to drop, when the water starts to clear. Prime times to be out there during the springtime. As you get a little later into the year, you'll start getting more of a mix of fish that are a little darker. You get past some of those, the fresh fish will continue to move in even during that middle part of the spring run, but some of the fish will get a bit darker. Some of the fish will start moving up tributaries to spawn, be a little more hit and miss even in this time period. Steelhead, and you get into this late spring period, steelhead will continue to move in. They'll trickle in some fresh fish, come in right at the end of the run. That's kind of how steelhead operate. They really spread themselves out. It's just the nature of their migration, and it can be spread out over months. You'll find more, a greater number of post-spawn fish as you get into later in the spring. And it's just really important to keep an eye on the water temperatures. I have often seen where once that water temperature consistently hitting in the low 60s, seems like the fish tend to back out at that point. And you really have to be careful just to make sure they don't get into that, mid high 60s, up to 70, where it can, actually be lethal for the fish. So you have to keep an eye on that. Just a couple ethical concerns here with spring fishing that, are worth mentioning. One is just, these fish are migrating up to spawn. They're spring spawners. And, certainly I think goes without saying, but, to stay away from, any spawning activity. A lot of rivers, the spawning activity will happen up in some of the smaller tributaries, but, other rivers, the spawning occurs right in the river. So, staying away from, even anything that even remotely looks like spawning fish, I tend to stay away from. And then as you get it, as I just mentioned, later into the run, you'll get more post-spawn fish. I think some anglers would prefer to not, deal, and even could be the ethical concern with fishing this post-spawn fish. I think in general, the post-spawn fish and the fresh fish will be found in, similar areas. So if you're, kind of turned off to post-spawn fish, I think really the best way to avoid that is, as you get towards the end of the run, just to kind of, call it quits and wait for the next fall run. Talk a little bit about kind of some of the last slides here. So hopefully nobody's falling asleep, but we're just going to talk a little bit about controlling the fly and really some of the key aspects to that. So when I'm making the cast across to swing the fly here, I'm making my cast in usually straight across, a little bit of an angle down, mending the line, right after the cast has been completed. Making a couple of mends can take tension off the fly and the tip and allow it to sink deeper. So that's one way that I can get my fly a bit deeper with that approach. And also just changing my angle, making that cast a little bit more upstream, a little more downstream. The important aspects of this is, we talked a little bit about making adjustments to your tip to get the fly down to the right depth. I think I can probably make similar adjustments by changing the angle of my cast, some aggressive mending as I can by making a tip change. So keep that as something that a good tool to have in your bag is to just monitor how you're mending, monitor how you're making your casts. The other thing too, and it was asked about before about putting weight on the fly, simply adding a weighted, using the same tip, whatever that is, a 10-foot, T7, 10-foot T10, and adding a little weight to the fly or a weighted fly, can make all the difference as well. So there's a lot of different ways to control your depth, and usually making a tip change is takes enough time and enough effort that it's usually my last option, and try those other options first. Throughout the swing, I like to try to control the speed of the fly. You're trying to play on the instinctive response of a steelhead to chase a fly, but it does seem like if the fly's swimming too fast, it can be a bit of a turnoff. Atlantic salmon like a fast swung fly. Steelhead seem to like a controlled swing fly. So, adding some upstream mends to the line just to slow down the speed. Sometimes you need to add a downstream mend to kind of get that fly swimming just the right speed. But for the most part, when I'm adding mends, they're very small. I don't want to change the actual swing path of the fly. I don't want to change how the fly is swimming. So a lot of times it just comes down to simple, I misspelled manipulation there, but just simple line manipulations that doesn't change the path of the fly, just changes the line, and just creates just enough to eliminate that big downstream belly in the line. Make sure you always swing that fly all the way out. The first fact there is just don't react too quickly to a grab or a take. I like to try to actually feel the weight of the fish take the fly, or that it's actually taking the fly. I use a click and pawl drag, and for the most part, I like to actually let the fish take a couple of clicks off the drag before I raise the rod to set the hook. Sometimes I realize that maybe the fish has dropped that fly, by waiting too long. I think there's some debate. Actually, I'm going to do an article later in the year about setting the hook and how to react to takes. But I always condition myself to not react too quickly. I like to try to feel the weight of the fish before I do anything. When you let that fly swing out, make sure it hangs down below you. A lot of times, particularly in the spring, I've noticed fish seem to be maybe a little more territorial and will just follow the fly, maybe feel like they're chasing it. So make sure you let it hang down there a little bit, because it does seem like you get more takes in the springtime on the hang down. I always like to add just a few short strips before I start stripping the line back for the next cast. And to kind of really slow that fly down, if you really want to slow it down, cold water situations, late winter, early spring, changing that angle of the rod so I'm actually pointing it out towards the opposite bank. Instead of pointing the rod at the fly during the swing, pointing it at the other bank, kind of really controls the amount of how the fly line crosses over the various current lanes. It's going to show the fly a little bit more butt first to the fish, but it really does slow down that swing and really keeps it in front of the fish's face for a longer period of time. Really good cold water technique. When you're fishing in the spring, make sure you fish all the water. It's the one thing that I think more in the springtime that I find fish in the less traditional lies. And this really includes fishing like faster runs, faster riffles. Don't pass anything by. Pretty much fish it through. Don't simply rely on the pools that you do well on in the fall or in the wintertime. Kind of expand the water that you fish, but don't pass by. I just feel like in the springtime the fish are on the move. They're more likely to be migrating, and as they're migrating up, they're going to go through these heavier spots. They might rest there. They might find a rock in those heavier spots. But don't just simply pass it by because that it's unproductive in the fall or winter. Fish more water. Also think in terms of cover and structure. If there's one thing that I've changed in the last 10 years with my steelhead fishing is focusing more on specific structure. And whether it be log jams, rocks, boulders, particularly, pockets that are created by boulders. I really make sure that I hit those spots hard. The more and more more I fish, the more I realize that, you can cover the idea of stepping and swinging, covers a lot of water, grids out that water. But sometimes, as you fish a pool, you start recognizing, well, you're catching a fish in this spot every time through. And then you start recognizing that it's because there's a certain structural element there. Really making sure that you're hitting those elements with various casts, various angles, and just kind of changing the speed of the swing and hitting those same structural elements 2 or 3 or 4 times before moving on. Especially on the Lake Erie streams, but really this can apply to really any of the Great Lakes streams. Really focus on those ledges and drop-offs. And the one thing you can see here is, I think you can see the cursor, but there's a series of ledges on this other side, and this really just drops right off along these ledges. And a real good technique here is to kind of cast up on the ledge, pull that fly back so that the fly is just off the edge, and then just sinks right along the edge of that, ledge. And as that fly sinks down and then starts to swing and pull away from there, can really be a deadly technique. And and that also applies to some of the deeper pockets and pools that I've seen on some of the Michigan and Midwestern rivers as well. But just trying to get that fly down deep quickly and then letting it kind of swing out of those areas can be really productive. And then just a little video here to kind of put this whole thing together. This was from a spring a couple of years ago. I think it was on, hopefully this video plays. All right, but making a cast across, just working my mend as I go across. Just, you can see very subtle mends, not changing the trajectory, the speed of the fly, just keeping it so that there's not too much of a downstream belly. Allowing that fly to swing all the way out, letting it hold right down there in the hang down position. Fish grabs are right down there in the hang down, right as it kind of came into that softer water. To me, that's what this is really all about. This is Easter Sunday a couple of years ago. The one thing that I'll point out here too is I generally like to keep the rod, especially with two-handed rods, longer rods, try to keep the rod in a fairly low position. I think it gives the fish less leverage to kind of wrench that fly out of its mouth. But right here, I know there's a lot of rocks and boulders in this pool, particularly right there in the middle. So I'm going to keep the rod tip up high, try to keep it out of the rocks and boulders. And, really fight to make sure that it doesn't wrap me around something. Certainly keeping that rod high helps with that. And as we kind of drop down in, fish is starting to tire, getting the fish in tighter or getting it in closer here, I'm going to drop that rod tip down, keep the rod fairly low, using that low position to kind of finish off the fight. That's kind of what it's all about, spring fishing in the Great Lakes. Oops, let's go to the next one here. So a little shameless self-promotion. You can follow me here on Instagram and on Facebook, just at Rick Kustich, my name. I also got a website that it's in sorely need of some updating that I'll be doing that this year. And just my latest couple books there, including way back in there is a DVD I did a couple years ago called Spay Days. And it's about a 4-hour coverage of various spots in the Great Lakes, swinging flies for steelhead. So if you've never seen that, that's some good video depiction of what the Great Lakes look like. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I hope that was informational and helpful to you. I wish you all the best of luck this spring, and open to taking as many questions as anybody has right now.
Thanks, Rick. That was great. I loved it. A couple questions rolling in. I certainly have some. Also, I was looking through hunting muskie with a fly the other day, and just couldn't believe how much you covered in there and how thorough it was. So that was very enjoyable, including seeing the two-handers in use for muskie, and the also the of course I love seeing Nick Pianessa wearing the Swing the Fly. I get a kick out of that every time. So anyways, great book on not Steelhead, but it's just an awesome read. So
thanks, Nick. Yeah, we're definitely playing more with the two-handers. I mean, I think I'm at the point now where outside of just some of the smaller river work, I think it'll be two-handers from now on in.
Yeah. We might have to get you on the hook for a presentation on that down the road.
Yeah, sounds good.
Wondering, one question is, other than like a situation where there was a hatch and you were dead drifting dries for steelhead, wondering about any tips you might have for trying to find a Great Lakes fish on a waker or a skating fly.
It seems like the two best times are, one of them is in the spring, and I'll address that in a second. But in the fall, it seems like when the water temperatures are, still in above 40, more likely in the high 40s, low 50s. And when you start to find fish that are, starting to pool up a bit, that seems to be the best opportunity. I think that in general, some of the rivers that have wild natural reproduction seem to be a bit better for surface fishing. And I know, like, my friend Larry Halleck up in Ontario has done quite well on on his river where he is fishing to wild fish. So I think there's that opportunity, but I do think that it's a wider opportunity than that. And that seems to be the time to focus on it, is the fall, when you can find some fish potted up, as opposed to fish that are on the move. But in the spring, the opportunity exists for fish when, and it's going to generally be fish that are dropping back down. But the spent fish a lot of times will really pool up, particularly in tail outs, be pretty aggressive. And again, I know that Jeff Liskey has done fairly well on his Ohio rivers, swinging, waking flies, later in the year when the water temperature gets warmer. So definitely opportunity there. Some of the again, Lake Erie streams where there isn't natural reproduction, where you can find some pooled up fish, just some elk hair caddis, steelhead caddis type flies can be pretty productive in those situations. So the opportunity's there. It's just a matter of, putting the tip away and trying the surface.
Awesome. I want to know about the Niagara, Rick.
Okay.
How do you swing a river that's that big?
Yeah. So the key with it is really just breaking it down. The Niagara drops off so quickly. You can step off that bank and be 6 foot deep. So there's not, and if you're making 50-foot casts, you're probably starting your swing out in 20 feet. So there's really not a lot of sense in fishing too far out. It's a matter of just breaking down what's in front of you. And, it fishes best when the water's off color and the fish are positioned a little closer to the bank. When the water gets clear, they tend to slide off into the deeper water. So that's really one of the things, is to try to fish it when the water conditions are right. But I'm generally just using a Skagit, 14, 15 foot of T14, sometimes T17, and a weighted fly along with that. Because not only is it deep, but it also has a lot of swirling currents and inconsistent currents. So you have to kind of combat all of that. So, getting down is the key. So I'm making casts that are generally angled up, making some mends, really trying to work hard on the setup, and then just kind of getting into swinging that more or less that latter, 45 degrees of the swing, making sure the fly's down in that range. But it's a challenge. It's not for everybody. I think it's a funny river from the standpoint that I think you kind of either love it or you hate it. And I've spent enough time over there over the years to love it, and certainly one of my favorite places to fish.
Thank you. We're giving it a minute here, Rick, see if any other questions come through. But that was thorough and terrific. So what issue of Fish and Fly was that there that's on your wall?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. It is. Let me look. It was August of 2003. So that's a Chinook from the Salmon River, actually, in New York.
Pretty neat.
Yeah.
You know this, but some of the people listening, Fish and Fly, the precursor to that was Wild Salmon and Steelhead. They were both put out by Tom Perrow. And one of the Wild and Steelhead ones, you'd authored an article. You might remember the title, but that's where I found that catnip pattern that I tied up for Steelhead on. And those were kind of the inspiration for Swing the Fly. So they'd both gone away, and there was kind of a gap and not much covering the swung fly world, even though it was gaining in popularity. So they've always kind of been the inspiration to get Swing the Fly going. Jim's wondering if there's many people in the Great Lakes swinging traditional patterns, classic flies, classic Atlantic salmon patterns and stuff like that.
Yeah, there definitely is. And I'll blend a few in myself, and I know some of my friends up in Ontario particularly are using some more traditional flies. Lady Caroline is my friend Larry Halleck's one of his main flies, one of his go-tos. So yes, there's definitely no reason why they wouldn't be effective if used in the Great Lakes, for sure. And that even goes for any of the more traditional Atlantic salmon flies. Some of the earlier West Coast steelhead flies are productive here. I think the tubes and the intruders have just become very popular just with their movement. They're just fun to tie. I think that the biggest thing with the hook placement in the rear of the fly just really lends itself to more hookups on those fish that are just kind of picking and plucking as that fly swings through. Also the shorter shank hook just lends itself to, I think, better landing ratio. So I just think from those standpoint, those flies have become more popular, not necessarily because they generally, not necessarily because they work better, and certainly traditional flies would work fine, given the right circumstances.
That's great. I think we've covered it unless anything rolls in here. I want to thank you, Rick, for putting this great presentation on, and also thank all our members of Swing the Fly for checking this out and for supporting Swing the Fly. That means a lot to all of us. So appreciate all of you. Anything else, Rick?
No, I think we're good. I think just go out and enjoy the spring. It's been a tough year. It's been a tough winter. It seems like the world's starting to get back to normal here, and I think one of the best ways to kind of kick that into gear is to get out and catch some steelhead and enjoy the rivers. So I wish everybody a great spring, and go out and enjoy it.
Same to you. All right.
All right,
buddy.
Thank you. Thanks, Zach. Thank you, everybody.